Good afternoon. I'm Warwick Saban, Executive Director of the Society of Fellows, and it is my pleasure to welcome all of you to this SOF digital discussion. I hope you and your loved ones are healthy and safe, and I want to thank you for being a part of the Society of Fellows. Your membership directly supports and sustains the work of the Aspen Institute, and that support and work is more critical now than ever before. And we're very pleased to have Steve Huffman as our featured guest today. Steve is the co-founder and CEO of Reddit, known as the front page of the internet and the fourth most visited website in the United States. After selling Reddit in 2006, Huffman was named to Inc. magazine's 30 Under 30 list in 2011 and the Forbes 30 Under 30 list in 2012. A few years later, Huffman returned as CEO of Reddit, where he has led the company's development of native image and video hosting, a new mobile app, and a full site redesign while growing the Reddit community to over 430 million monthly users. And Steve will be interviewed by Christine Lagorio-Chafkin. Christine is a senior writer at Inc.com and Inc. magazine, where she covers America's largest private companies. She served as a co-host of the award-winning Inc. Uncensored podcast and is launching a new interview-based podcast called What I Know. She's also the author of the book, We Are the Nerds, The Birth and Tumultuous Life of Reddit, the Internet's Culture Laboratory. So today, Steve will talk about the community and the platform he built 15 years ago and provide insight into why the Reddit community-based model is different from other companies in the space. He will also reflect on Reddit's history and the company's vision for the next 15 years and delve into other issues such as privacy, navigating tech giants, and the complexities of talking about politics online. As with all of our SOF digital discussions, Steve will be glad to answer your questions after the initial conversation, and you can submit your questions anytime by simply clicking the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and typing them in. If you encounter any problems during this event, please email the SOF hotline and our team will be glad to assist you. So Steve and Christine are going to chat for the first 20 or 30 minutes, and then I will pose your questions to them for the rest of the event. So Christine, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Warwick. I really appreciate that. And Steve, thank you so much for joining us today. I want to just dive right in. Tell me the state of Reddit as it exists right now. You're past 400 million monthly users. And I read somewhere that revenue is going to be over 250 million this year. Is that correct?
Okay, so first, thank you for having me, Warwick. Thank you for the introduction, Christine. Really nice to see you. Okay, state of Reddit, specifically revenue. I don't know what our revenue is going to be this year. We are in the, that was the plan, but I'm pretty sure we're not going to be on the plan because we are in the ads business. And the ads business is basically one-to-one correlated with the GDP. And I think as we're all living, the economy is going through some, I think, pretty incredible machinations right now. So I think the overall health of the business is really great. We're still growing year over year. Traffic is actually up quite a bit through all of this. But anybody in the ads business knows that this is a chaotic time for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And how has user growth been tracking? I noticed, it was sort of stagnant-ish for a while, and now all of a sudden it's well over 400 million. How much exactly has coronavirus affected that growth?
I mean, overall in our traffic, we've seen 20% in the whole site, and then there's certain communities that have grown substantially more. Obviously, the ones directly related to the coronavirus have absolutely exploded, and then a lot of communities for people to converse, to share how they're coping, video games, things that people are doing while they're at home. All of those communities have grown quite tremendously over the last couple of months.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, why don't we take us back a little bit in time, or actually a lot bit. Revenue wasn't always a thing for Reddit. Why don't you walk us back to the early days in your vision for the company, which didn't necessarily include revenue at the start, and how that vision sort of, give us a little bit of insight into how that vision sort of shaped into what Reddit is today.
Sure. So, I mean, in the Reddit, as you know, has had a long history. So depending on how far back we go, if we go to the very beginning,
Very beginning, very
Reddit
beginning.
wasn't even a company in my mind. It was a homework assignment, practically. We got this opportunity, my college roommate Alexis and I, to be a part of Y Combinator, which was started by this guy, Paul Graham, that I really looked up to. And so to me, like, our motivation was, you know, I want to basically go on this adventure, and I don't want to look stupid in front of Paul Graham. And so we weren't thinking about company, let alone revenue. You know, I think I was 21 when we started Reddit. So we've had quite an evolution since then. And you know, we started Reddit, and I had a lot of, I think, idealism about the internet and the ads business. That is to say, I didn't like the ads business. And so that was definitely a big part of Reddit for a long time. Now, being firmly in the ads business, I think my attitude has changed quite a bit, and we're seeing a lot of success here at Reddit. And I think what was required in that transformation was an understanding that, you know, there's ads don't have to come at the expense of the product you're building. And in fact, the two can work together really well. One of our brand strategists at Reddit has this saying that I love, which is users hate ads, but they love brands. I think it kind of catches the sentiment, which is companies have a home on Reddit to talk to their customers. But I think it's certainly taken time and evolution for us to get to where we are today. And for me too, for that matter, for me to kind of, I think, grow along with it.
Great. Let's talk about, from the beginning, the community structure, which was sort of always there. When Reddit was founded, as I kind of I talk about the history a lot in my book, and kind of go through the beginnings of the algorithm and the community structure, and discuss how there were sort of two secret sauces in the mix from the beginning. And these are things that kind of differentiated Reddit from every other community-based site on the internet, every other social site. So Steve, can you talk a little bit about the upvoting and downvoting that was kind of core to Reddit from the very start, and also the algorithm?
Sure. So we spent a lot of time in the beginning trying to figure out the idea, like the seed of the idea we had is that there are one of the websites that I loved the most when we started Reddit was Slashdot. Slashdot's still around, but the title was News for Nerds, Stuff That Matters. And so on its surface, it was headlines, but beneath the headlines were these comments. And in the comments, this like really smart, funny, interesting community existed. And so we had this aspiration of building a community like that, but where the headlines weren't chosen by editors, they were chosen by users. And so that got us thinking about ranking. And it took us a number of steps. So we have voting on Reddit, and every piece of content on Reddit, whether it's a post or a comment, can be both voted up or down. Actually, in the early days, we didn't have the arrows. We tried to put words, we tried to put labels on it. And so we had like interesting and uninteresting, but it wasn't quite right. We had cool and uncool, and that definitely didn't work because like there'd be bad news and you'd be like, cool. And so we went with the arrows, which just don't have the words associated with it, so users can decide for themselves. One of the things I think makes Reddit different from a lot of our peers, even still today, is now it's taken for granted that websites that have user-generated content, which was not always the case then, and then two, that content's going to be ranked by the users through some sort of like, a heart, a retweet, or an upvote on Reddit, a positive affirmation. Reddit's the only one that has the negative affirmation, period, or at least so front and center. And I think that part of it's a really important aspect of Reddit, because that's where people our users reject behaviors that they don't like. And I think it's the online equivalent of the social or peer pressure to behave well. And so that's why I think one of the cornerstones to why our communities are self-healing in a way that we don't see elsewhere online. And as for the ranking algorithm, we had a simple but I think really smart idea that this guy, Chris Slow, our CTO now, came up with back in 2005. I don't even think he was on the team at this very moment. I'm not sure. Maybe you had just joined us. But nevertheless, I described to him the way I wanted it to work, the way I wanted it to look, which was like the Billboard, like top 40. We wanted good stuff to rise really fast and stay there and hang around a while other stuff maybe doesn't have quite as long a life. And so to have this kind of constant turnover of interesting stuff. And we had a kind of a simple way of describing that mathematically, and that was the algorithm we used for a very long time. And it created this kind of serendipitous experience on Reddit where you never knew what you were going to find, but it was probably going to be good or interesting.
Yeah, and it amazed me in the reporting over the years that algorithm, while it's changed over the years, conceptually, it kind of hasn't that much. It's still the same at its core in terms of how users interact with the site.
Yeah, I mean, even still on an individual community, it's the same algorithm.
Yeah.
We've changed one constant to make it turn over faster, because back in 2005, 24 hours was fast. But now, if you come back to Reddit an hour later and see the same post, you're like, oh my gosh, like what is it, Reddit broken? And so, but it's the same. It's other than the turnover speed, it's the same for communities. Now, when you get to the front page or your front page, it gets more complex because we're merging together lots of communities and some are bigger than others. And so that's where we've done a lot of tweaking. But that algorithm has served us very well. And I think we'll continue to do so for a while.
Great. I want to help folks fast forward then a little bit through Reddit's history. This thing you built within about a year, basically, Condé Nast came knocking and paid you guys a sum that made you each millionaires for it. Then you stayed at Condé 3 years, finally left, which led to you starting another company in travel. And then, you wouldn't return to Reddit until it had gone through these insanely wild days, including one CEO leaving after a middle of the night ultimatum, and another essentially being harassed out of her job. Now, at that time, the Reddit community almost mutinied. And without going into too much detail about that, that's when you step back in. The site seemed to some people like it was in real danger of snuffing itself out at the time. Was this a lesson in the fragility of social networks, do you think? And how fragile was Reddit at that time?
I'm not sure we'll ever know for sure. I believed that Reddit was killing itself. That was the thought that I had in my head when I decided to come back, because I'd been resistant to returning to Reddit because I didn't want to leave my other company. And it was in that moment where I saw Reddit, the way I've described it in the past, as actively committing suicide in front of the entire internet. And so that was the cornerstone of that decision. Now, would Reddit have actually died? I don't know, and I'm genuinely curious, because one of the things I've come to really appreciate about Reddit, particularly over the last few years, is how resilient it is. In that you kind of touched on the ups and downs that we've had. Reddit has had a tumultuous history and has faced all sorts of challenges, many self-inflicted and many a side effect of growing up on the internet when we did, and yet we've survived them all. And I don't think we can take credit, like we as like the management team, for having like perfectly navigated these things, because if you've read a newspaper in the last 10 years, that's not exactly the case. So I think there's some dimension to like what Reddit is a byproduct of people being together. My belief is that when people are together, they create communities, they create structures, they create things, and Reddit is an outlet for that. And I think Reddit is a microcosm of the whole internet, which is an outlet for the kind of built-in collaborative nature of people. And so I want to believe that Reddit was going to die and I saved it. That's a nice story. But I also want to believe that Reddit would have survived and thrived no matter what, because I think that's kind of partially the nature of Reddit. So that's a very long-winded way of saying I'm not sure.
No problem. I think it's fascinating to consider. This is a short question, but a complicated one. What steps did you then take to turn the site around?
Sure. So there were, I think, two big dimensions to our thinking at the time. The first is that there was a lot of low-hanging fruit, like sensible, obvious, practical things that we could do. Have a mobile app. Like we shipped our first native mobile app in 2017. So just before the 10-year anniversary of the iPhone. I think that was a huge one because the internet is moving to the phone. There's some other product areas where, for example, I felt that this was a little bit, I think, more in my wheelhouse. I thought the trolls on Reddit were getting the best of us, and there was some algorithmic changes we could make to make the site more fair. And so there's a fair amount of work on that aspect of things, which is also intertwined with safety, making sure our users are having safe experiences on Reddit. Because, those of us who worked at Reddit or used Reddit a lot know what like an incredible, wonderful place it could be, but that was not our reputation at the time. And so I really wanted our reputation to match our day-to-day experience. And so closing that gap. And then finally, one of the bigger areas was just the culture of the company. And this is still an area where I spend a lot of my time thinking. Great companies are built by great people and have great cultures. And great cultures attract great people. They create great people. They kind of allow all of these like, great to use the word again, things to come out. And so we had to, I think, do a pretty big shift in the culture of the company. And honestly, like looking back on it, the lesson there was, I think the only way to really change the culture of the company is to change the people. And so we pretty much turned over the entire company over the next 2 years.
Wow. So just a little bit of change there. So in some ways, that transition was not made any easier by the next election cycle. There was a massive community that popped up called the Donald that had begun growing at that time. Can you talk about its growth in those days and how your community team worked with it or dealt with it?
Yes, the Donald, rest in peace. That when I mentioned before about the trolls getting the best of us, I think the Donald was the most concentrated version of that. What we saw in the lead up to that election, and really for the year after, is a community of people who were, and just even take the politics out of it, born on the internet, loved attention, know how social media works, know how Reddit work, and really were effective at, as I said, getting the best of us, at getting their content all over the front page of Reddit. And so this has taken, I think, quite a bit of effort for us to rein in, because, and the challenge here is, that gets layered on with the Donald, is that it's a political community. And so we welcome all political views on Reddit. We think this is really important, and to the extent that Reddit is a company or platform born out of democracy, and that is one of the ways we think about it through our voting system and how Reddit is entirely created and run by users, making sure that everybody has a fair shot. But we care a lot about behavior and the safety of our users, and making sure that that when any community is growing, it's not at the expense of the platform, not at the expense of other communities, and not running afoul of our policies. And so the Donald was challenging because they knew where the line was. And like any good troll on the internet, they know exactly where the line is, and they constantly test the boundaries, like the raptors in Jurassic Park. They're constantly poking and prodding and testing, and not just testing the boundaries, but probably testing our patience. So there's a number of changes to make the site kind of more fair for everybody. I think that good stuff came out of that. The Donald actually inspired a lot of our harassment policy changes, and how we kind of thought about that, helped us crystallize our thinking. Our enforcement of our policies got a lot better. And then, I think we got to a much better place over the last year, where, we culminated with the Donald, where we were just not successful in getting that community to rein in some of their policy violations. So we quarantined them, which quarantining is basically a family of sanctions that we apply to communities before banning them. And so we quarantined the Donald, this was like late last year, basically as a very stern warning to clean up. We escalated that over the course of this spring by basically firing moderators who weren't willing to moderate to our content policy. Now to the point where the Donald is I don't know, it's a practically non-existent now. I think the moderators of that community did not want to operate within our rules, and so they largely left. And so the community is basically defunct at this point, which is not how I thought this was going to end, to be honest. But it's been kind of a long tail, and it's, I think, affected our thinking in a lot of dimensions.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Can you talk a little bit about how within the company you guys are all organized, your teams are organized to deal with that kind of stuff, from spam to harassment to noxious content to propaganda as we move into the next election cycle? And you know, it's very different than the way Facebook, say, is organized, with tens of thousands of low-paid contractors all over the globe in, you know, massive centers culling stuff, right?
Yes, so there's a lot to this. So
you can be brief about it. You don't have to give us the whole, you know,
yeah,
or chart here.
I think you know where I was going with this. There's I could talk about this all day. Basically, you know, there are a variety of teams here. So we've got the policy team, which is a small group where we think very carefully about the policies that we should have on Reddit and the ones that we're able to enforce at a broad scale. We've got our safety organization, which includes a couple of pillars. So they've got a team that works solely on misinformation and abuse and the kind of like manipulation of Reddit. We've got a team called anti-evil, and there's kind of two dimensions to that. There's the anti-evil operations people who basically their job is to enforce our content policies. So the spam, harassment, misinformation, involuntary pornography, violence, all of this stuff, that's their job. We've got the anti-evil engineers, who are the team that builds tools for the former group. Then expanding out a little bit, we have our community team, which the community team's job at a very high level is to be the public face of Reddit. So to explain Reddit to our users, to help resolve the kind of day-to-day, you know, disputes between users or between communities, that sort of stuff. They call that keeping the peace. And, you know, responding to moderator help requests and user help requests, all that sort of stuff. And then we get outside the company. And so this is where it gets really interesting for Reddit. We have the moderators. The moderators are users who create and run communities. And so they create the communities, they name the communities, they write the rules, they set the tone. Every community on Reddit has its own set of rules that go above and beyond Reddit's content policies. These rules can be very, very strict. We have some communities that are like our science community literally has a rule that's no joking. And enforcing a no joking rule on the internet is no joking matter. And so they actually have thousands of moderators who enforce that. And then we get beyond the moderators into the greater community, which we've touched on. Every piece of content on Reddit has an up and down vote. And this is where the users enforce not only their community rules, but their community culture and the unwritten rules. One of the ways I think about this is just think about in the United States. We have laws that dictate things we can and can't do, but then there are unwritten rules, like the social contract that around etiquette and the way we behave. And on Reddit, there's the same thing. We've got our community policies, which are like federal laws, the community rules, which are like state laws, and then there's the unwritten rules that are enforced by our users that are probably the most important, that kind of govern the etiquette of various communities and Reddit overall. So all of these things come together, I think, to allow us to, I think, together moderate content on Reddit in a way that is impossible, I think, at any scale for other platforms to do.
Great. One thing that a lot of non-Reddit users cannot get their heads around is that users on Reddit are not really connected to their person identity in the same way they are elsewhere online. Some are, some aren't, some are various degrees of anonymity. You sometimes call it pseudonymous. And you know, this is a weird strategy that took advertisers years to wrap their heads around, but lately, you know, and especially a couple of years ago in the wake of the Cambridge Analytica scandal, it seemed pretty smart all of a sudden. You know, you testified in front of Congress about this in part. If you testified before Congress again today regarding the social web and putting kind of Reddit in contrast with other social sites, what would you tell them?
I mean, I would tell them what I've been telling them for years, which is if on the topic of identity, there are so many facets to folks' identities that are not necessarily associated with our real world identities or our names, our personas. For example, I've got this persona with you all where I'm explaining Reddit and I'm doing my job as the CEO of Reddit. But I've got another one with my friends and family, and I've got other ones, you know, on Reddit. And I think all of these facets of my personality are really important. And so this allows people, there's always been this accusation or this fear that if you take away people's names, then their behavior gets worse. And I think I want to change that a little bit. It's if you take away people's reputation or incentive to behave well, their behavior might get worse. But what we see on Reddit, where even though your name isn't there, your reputation is there, and your incentive to behave well is still very high, because otherwise you're going to get rejected by the community. So this is where I think the community values and norms are really important. And the conversation of identity often comes up in the context of safety. And I think it's really important to acknowledge that not attaching your name to something actually makes you more safe. For example, if you are a teenager struggling with your sexuality, you may be embarrassed or afraid to go to your friends and family, but you can go to a community on Reddit and work through some of these issues and find other people who can help you or have gone through this themselves and can give you support. We see this with new parents. We see this with people struggling with drug and alcohol addiction. We see this with sex workers. There's so many groups of people that are in vulnerable positions. And I shouldn't even say so many people. Literally everybody has something. And being able to, I think, work through that something and find support, or if you're on the other side of it, give support is really important. So I actually think being able to control your identity is what's critically important.
Great. Now that everyone who's watching sort of knows a little bit about the history of Reddit, the way the algorithm works, the way privacy works, the way you deal with harassment and spam and all of the bad stuff, how has Reddit been preparing for this upcoming election?
Well, you know, it's interesting. So if you'd asked me this question a few months ago, I would have given you this answer, which is we've learned a tremendous amount in the wake of 2016. We've invested tremendously in our teams around safety and our policies and our ability to enforce it and find misinformation and protect ourselves against that. And based on everything we learned, or based on everything we know today, we feel like we're prepared for 2020. And all of that is still true. What's interesting is the type of misinformation we're seeing. We were expecting this to be the election year, and instead it's the pandemic year. And so now we're applying all of those lessons to a new type of misinformation in a new situation where we're trying to help users find the information they need, surface important information, identify and limit the impact of misinformation regarding the virus. And so fortunately, I think we've done a pretty good job at that, and our communities have done a very good job at that. But we haven't really, I think by we, I mean all of us collectively haven't been thinking much about the election right now, because there's kind of one thing going on, and it's the virus.
Yeah, pandemic year is upon us. I guess how is your company doing, like, in terms of dealing with COVID? You're all distributed now? There's probably no one in the building of what, 500 people?
Yeah, we've been working from home since early March in all of our offices. I think what we saw is there was, I think, really 2 weeks of fear, and this was kind of, I think, ripped through the whole country and around the world of what's going on, how long is this going to last, what's happening, the economy is tanking, all of these things, kind of everything happening at once. One of the things I've learned through Reddit is that humans are incredibly resilient, and to that end, I've been really impressed with how not just our company, but I think the world at large has adapted to this situation and has come together. And as we can start to see the light at the end of the tunnel, like we know it's there, we don't know exactly when it's coming, but we can see it's there. We're going to make it through this. That's been very heartening. And at Reddit, I think despite the chaos we faced, I think it's really important for us to continue to remind ourselves how fortunate we really are to be at a company that can weather a storm like this, to be at a company that can provide value to people in a time of need, when they're searching for community or information or just a few laughs, in that we're in a position where we're not having to do massive layoffs like other companies are having to do. Some great companies are having to do, in fact. So, I think there's so much to be thankful for, and there's so many opportunities that have presented themselves that we can, I think, lean into. So that's kind of where our head's at right now.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Steve. We're going to take some questions from attendees now, and I think Warwick is here to moderate those.
Indeed, and terrific conversation, Christine. Thank you for terrific questions, and Steve as well. I'm going to move right into the questions we're getting from SOF members, because there are quite a few. Some are related specifically to Reddit, and some are more general. So I'm going to start with the ones that are more sort of directly related to Reddit. And George asks, what kind of subreddits have arisen since the pandemic hit, and what is your favorite subreddit?
So the subreddits that have grown in the pandemic, obviously the coronavirus ones and the geo versions of those, the ones that I've seen that have been kind of fun that are adjacent, there's been a lot of cooking. Cooking communities have grown up, and there's what's it called, like quarantine cuisine or something like that. It's like people, basically everybody, including myself, is learning how to cook. It seems like, and which is, I don't know, I guess it says something about the state of our society, that a huge percentage of it doesn't want to feed itself, but nevertheless. So there's been all of those, all the new hobby communities. Those have been really fun to see. For me, my favorite community, it's shifting. I think one that's always reliable for me these days is casual conversation. Casual conversation is, as the name implies, it's just people kind of shooting the shit, sharing small victories in their lives, just talking about stuff. I find that's one of the ones that I can most reliably participate in, because there's no there's not a lot of weight to it. You can just kind of be yourself, and so that's probably my current favorite.
That's great. And Katie Gerson asks, not being a Reddit user, but curious, over the last 15 years, have you observed specific shifts in user behaviors pushing new social boundaries other than the Donald? And what kinds of social themes are you seeing?
Oh, wow, really great question. So I would say Reddit, one of the fun things about working at Reddit is I feel like our jobs are less as tech and product people and more as anthropologists studying this thing that continues to evolve. And so Reddit's evolving, and then I think our own understanding of it continues to evolve with it. And so Reddit has given me this very optimistic view of humanity. And sometimes I think people raise their eyebrows when I talk about this, especially over the last 4 years where maybe people are a little more pessimistic. But what I've seen time and time again is the way that people help each other and support each other, and I think really bring out the best in each other. And I think that's really incredible. And to the extent where I think, speaking with the United States in mind, in particular, despite us growing internationally, I think the story of kind of my generation, I'm like the elder millennial, I think, is the kind of families spreading out, the church being less important. These kind of like old institutions of community in our society have spread out or weakened, and then increasingly people turn online for that to fulfill that need. And so that's something I think we've watched play out on Reddit, is how people build digital relationships and find a digital community. And I think that's been really interesting to see. But it's kind of cemented this idea in my head that like people need community, like regardless of where they're getting it from, online or offline. It's something that I think we as people need. And so we didn't quite understand that in 2005. We've seen it grow, because Reddit didn't have communities. It was just one pile of links in the early days. That's literally how I described it. It's a pile of links. So watching it grow into this vast network of communities that we did not design, I think is really been really cool to see.
So that actually leads nicely into a question from Cynthia. She asks, what personal values of yours have you instilled in the digital Reddit community and in the company culture of Reddit?
Oh, great question.
Can I answer this too?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. Do you want to go first?
He's a total troll, everyone. The trollishness in the early days. He's a jokester, sarcastic.
So, okay, yeah, we pioneered trolling on Reddit, so I'm sorry for that one world. But trolling is not one of our values, unfortunately. But we do have a couple that are intertwined with Reddit, of our company values. One that I was just talking about is believe in the good. So we're confronted, so I think values are tools for making decisions. That it's a way of scaling culture at work. And so I think about values a lot. One of the ones that we have is believe in the good, because we're confronted with this decision a lot at Reddit, which is build this new feature and give it to users. And whatever the feature is, it often has the same shape, which is users are going to do something with it and we can't predict it. And so there's I think a natural instinct to be afraid of that, especially after everything Reddit's been through and the internet's been through and the world's been through. It's like, well, if we let users just, the inmates run the asylum, like what are they going to do? But believe in the good means, yeah, there's always some risk associated with this, but by and large, people are going to do really incredible things. And I've learned two things whether it was image uploading or video uploading or text posts or chat or streaming or our place, the April Fool's thing we did a couple years ago. When we give users a surface area, when we give people a surface area to be creative, two things happen. One, they use it, and two, they use it in ways that surprise us. And so I think the willingness to be surprised and the optimism that we're probably going to be surprised in a good way is really important. But back to Christine's point, yes, we have lived on the frontiers of the wild west of the internet for long enough to not be quite so naive to not take our eye off what's going on. And I think we do have to adapt, which is one of our other values, evolve. Like we have to constantly be evolving. So those, I think, are two examples.
Okay. Well, speaking of constantly evolving, the next question is from Josh, and he asks, during this unique time, have you felt more creative or less? Do you have any new ideas for Reddit or beyond that you have developed recently?
Oh, okay. Unquestionably more creative. This working from home has been, for me personally, really fun, because I don't have kids. And so working from home and spending all day on a computer is basically like the first 25 years of my life, where I was basically alone playing with my computer and occasionally exercising. So this is very comfortable for me. And my job has changed dramatically too, because I used to travel a lot to do events like this. Well, this one would have been in San Francisco, but who knows where I would have been. So I had to travel a lot, do lots of speaking stuff, whatever for work. So all of that's gone. And so all of a sudden, and my team's gotten a lot better. We've all gotten a lot better. So I have this like surplus of time right now, which has actually allowed me to be creative in a way that I haven't been in years. And so really get to think about Reddit there's like, I think, a lot of fun feature ideas I'm really excited about that I think I probably can't share right now, but I think there's ways of interacting on Reddit and again, kind of bringing people closer and revealing their creativity that I'm super excited about now. So it's been really fun, I think, for me to have space to kind of think in a way that I haven't in years.
That's great. And thanks for reminding me to mention, by the way, that this event originally was to be in person in San Francisco. And so we pivoted to put it online, and you still have the option to ask questions. So if you haven't had a chance yet, there's a button at the bottom of your screen that says Q&A. You can hit that, type in your question, and I will read it. So speaking of that, the next question actually comes from someone who didn't put their name, but he or she says, last week we heard from Tim Wu and Kara Swisher about their views on big tech and its breakup, as well as potential antitrust violations. So Steve, what are your thoughts on that subject?
Nuanced or complicated. Ultimately, it's the government's decision or the Justice Department's decision. So, we'll let that play its course. If you're to ask me generally my thoughts on big businesses, there's pros and cons to it. I'll start with the cons. I think those are the ones that people most easily grasp, which is they can drift into monopolies, into monopolistic behavior, into anti-competitive behavior, and ultimately behavior that's bad for consumers. But on the good side, they can do things that might not otherwise get done. I think of Bell Labs. So Bell was a monopoly that ultimately was broken up. Bell had Bell Labs, and Bell Labs created the laser. They created, was it radio or radar? They created all sorts of stuff that cellular technology, I believe, all sorts of stuff that like affects our life pretty profoundly now. So I don't think big companies are inherently bad or that big is necessarily bad. And I think that the kind of the reasoning behind anti-trust laws is to ensure a level playing field. Like big is okay if you're playing fair. And so I think we'll leave it up to the Justice Department to determine whether the companies they're investigating have been playing fair or not.
Great. And then our final question comes from Dave Dillon, and he asks, with your intuition for today's digital consumer, what do you think our willingness will be to all be tracked digitally for tracing COVID cases?
Oh boy. Okay, so I'm going to give you a very long-winded, I don't know. 5 years ago, it seemed like we at Reddit were the only idealists left. We had watched Facebook and Twitter and Instagram explode in popularity. And I remember looking at this with some amount of envy, thinking, man, Reddit, we were there. We're 15 years old. We were there. We're older than a lot of these companies. We're older than YouTube, older than Twitter, or as old, whatever. And they're so much bigger than we are. And like, and I remember thinking like, gosh, is it like, we've had these idealistic views and have those hamstrung our platform? And the answer is maybe yes, probably just our own incompetence at the time, but nevertheless, I wonder, do people just not care about their privacy? Do they not care that they're just giving all this information, these videos and pictures and behavior stuff, just giving it all away? And that just made me sad. And then over the last couple of years, we see all of a sudden, oh, people do care about privacy. They just didn't know what was going on. So that makes me a little bit more, I think, encouraged. Look, this has been a constant trade-off since the beginning of our country, the balance between freedom and security, or privacy and security. These things aren't always at odds with each other, but sometimes they are. And so, yeah, I think there's a compelling argument to be made that if we can track our locations and who we're interacting with, we can prevent the spread of this disease. But I mean, listen to the words I just said. Gosh, who wants to track their location and who they've been with? And so I think those are really important trade-offs. And I hope that whatever we do here, it's temporary. And I know that's a very naive thing to say because these things tend to move in only one direction. And so it's with some, I think, a amount of sadness that I kind of share that view.
Yeah, well, we could certainly do a whole event just on that subject, and we may well do that before this is all said and done. But I do want to thank both of you for taking the time to join us. It was a terrific conversation and a very timely conversation. So thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you for having me. It was really my honor. Thank you, everybody watching, for your attention, and thank you, Christine, for facilitating the really great conversation.
Absolutely. And I want to thank all of our members as well for joining us today. I want to let you know also that our next SOF digital discussion is coming up on Tuesday of next week. It will feature Lisa Hamilton, who's the president and CEO of the Annie E. Casey Foundation. She'll be in conversation with Jane Wales, who's the executive director of the program on philanthropy and social innovation here at the Aspen Institute. And they'll be talking about addressing immediate need, catalyzing enduring change, the important role of philanthropy amid crisis. So obviously an important subject. We hope you can join us next Tuesday. Until then, stay safe, stay healthy, and thanks again for being a member of the Society of Fellows. Good day.